Table is something with chairs, and you sit in them, and then you can eat, you can bang on them. This is a table. So we've been getting a lot of requests from people to show them how we do some of what we do. We're going to start taking a stab at some how-tos. One of the projects that has been the most requested is our tables. The tables that we're talking about are pretty much made of steel and wood. It's constructed out of a steel frame with a 2x6 top that is distressed and covered with epoxy. They hold up really well. They're really easy to keep clean. Just a real good environment for a restaurant. The steps are the importance of a plan. We prepare the wood, cut the wood, then we have to finish the wood, the assembly of the tabletop itself. After we assemble the 2x6s onto our plywood base, we're also going to discuss how we're going to fill those the cracks with grout and cover it with epoxy, and then we'll move on to the frame and the support. I'll try to show you in detail what we do. If you have a welder, what we did is really simple and actually really good. If you're building it with wood, then you're going to probably have to take some different steps, and I'll go over those with you as well. You always got to start with a plan. So, how big is your room? What's the area you want the table to be? You have to start with a plan so that you know what you want it to look like and how big you want it to be. Once you have that done, I would draw it out. Even if it's just a really rough sketch, the pieces have to fit together. I'm not an artist, so I'm gonna start with the different components in the tabletop. So when we're done, it's gonna look something like this. Like I said, I can't draw, so. That's our kind of our finished table. You're gonna have 5 2x6s laying right next to each other with about a 1/4 inch gap in between them. That can vary a little bit depending on exactly how big your frame is and what you use for your frame and stuff like that. So basically what is underneath this is just a square sheet of plywood, and it's going to be 24 inches wide by 96 inches long. The reason this matters, this is all part of your planning stage, is because this is how I can just build my tabletops and then they just fit into my frames. The edges of this board here and these boards here, when you build this outer square, you want it to overhang. So it's gonna overhang this piece of plywood. This right here would be my 2x6s. So the outer edge of those 2x6s is gonna hang over the plywood by 2 inches in every direction. So if my plywood's 24 inches wide, then the edges of these 2x6s should be about 28 inches wide, giving us 2 inches on each side of the plywood. And on the bottom side, our frame is going to line up perfectly with the edge of that. So based off of knowing this, I know that this right here is going to be 28 inches wide. All right, and I know that this right here is going to be 100 inches. And I'm basically doing that by simply adding 4 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches, and then adding 2 inches, 2 inches. So that's the outside dimension of my frame now. So if we're looking at this from the top, like we are right now, our frame, okay, so this would be 2 inches wide. So I want 2 inches right here, which will account for my 2 inches is hanging out past my plywood. So this area right here is where my plywood will drop into, and then my 2x6s will overhang over the top of that. So the inside of this is going to be really close to, if this is 24 by 96, then this would be like 24 1/4 by 96 1/4 on my inside. And again, you can build the whole top first and then measure this and make sure you know exactly how big your plywood is, exactly how much your overhead came to, and then you can adjust your build of your frame to accommodate that. Work out your measurements, work out your finishes, everything that you plan to do so that you can get going with it. Now that we have our plan, we know what we're doing, where we're going, the next step is going to be to start preparing all of the components. So yeah, the first thing you want to do with your boards is cut them to length. So before you can cut them to length, this is why you got to refer back to your plan. You have to have a general idea as to how this is all going to go together, or else your board lengths are going to really mess up the rest of your build. There's two parts of the boards to this particular table. You have the plywood, which I'm going to call the base. The reason that I did that is because it really helps hold your lumber together halfway flat and even. By using a 3/4 inch base plywood underneath that, it allows me to basically screw those things down, those 2x4s, in this case 2x6s down, and it holds them nice and flat and right in the right spot. When I set out to do these tables, I looked really hard at waste. I came up with the closest recipe I could that I could use a piece of plywood and just cut it right down the middle. You know, I could get 2 tables out of 1 sheet of plywood. Then once I did that, I then didn't want to have to rip my 2x6s either. So what I did is I then figured out how I could space my 2x6s to that plywood without having to rip any of them. I want this to be under it, but I want it not to be so tight that we can't get that board in there. So I think that gives us enough wiggle room there, I think. I'm advising you guys to do as much planning as you can ahead of time. I don't really practice what I preach. Then we went on to making all the individual boards. The processes that we go through there is basically going to be the rough prep, basically antique them or distress them. We do that using just brute force, and we also do that using a torch. When you're doing this kind of construction, you want it to have flaws. The flaws are what creates a lot of the beauty in wood, a lot of the beauty in steel. So the first thing we do then is, and in this case, is we took our 2x6s and we cut them to the length we wanted, and then we just started beating them with a chain. We then move on and we burn the boards. Again, it's bringing out those imperfections in the wood. You're not just wanting to make them all completely black. I like to bring out the grain. By burning it, you really bring out a real cool dark grain. For burning it, you can use any sort of a propane torch. Fire is fire. Just be careful, be someplace where you're not going to start anything else on fire that you don't want to start on fire. And try to make it look even and look the way that you want it to look. What we do is we just hit it with a real light sandpaper. We just want to kind of make sure there's nothing really jaggedy and sharp. Then we go over the entire boards with a stain. You can do just one coat, but you really should wait at least 8 hours before you go over that with any form of clear coat or sealer. And I went over them again with just a polyurethane. I just go with a thin coat because all we're really trying to do is seal the stain. And on other projects, that would be our final finish. We would just do several coats of the polyurethane and we got a very nice finish. But for this, we're going to go over with an epoxy, so we're going to stop at that point, and it's now ready to assemble. After you've measured out and figured exactly where you want to screw your 2x6s onto your plywood, you do that with the outer edges of the plywood and the outer edges of the table so that it lines up with the outer edges of your frame. And I put the entire outer edges together. So what that means is I started by putting my 2 outside boards on my table, and then I put my ends on the table. And then I had a gap in between, and I adjusted that, and I just kept the same reveal or the same line between each one of my 2x6s. But I have to stress, we used math. It wasn't just, well, I'm going to put those boards there and there. We knew about what we expected the gaps of our boards to be, That matters because when I adjust my gaps between my boards on the center, I want those gaps to look the same as the gap that I have on the ends. So we kind of had a pretty good idea of what all that was going to be before we started the build. So once we had that done, then it's just simply a matter of putting the rest of the boards in and filling and adjusting our cracks to where they all look the same. Can't use too much glue in a project like this. When I attached this to the plywood, I really wanted to make sure that the plywood became one with my 2x6s. Glue it. There's no reason not to. Put a lot of glue on there and then make sure you get it all screwed down really tight, and you're gonna have a really solid tabletop when you're done. I mean, that tabletop ain't gonna come apart. Okay, after we have the 2x6s screwed down and glued and all of that, I then went and put my grout in between my 2x. From past projects that I'd done with epoxy, that I couldn't leave a crack in between my boards because the epoxy would follow that crack. So I decided to put concrete between all of my 2x. I just went with, Quikrete makes a patch, a concrete patch that's a real high PSI concrete. Comes in a little yellow tub. At the end of the day, you have cracks between your boards, you want to fill them. You fill them the exact same way you grout tile. You make a slurry of sorts. You have to seal the edges of your end boards. Those are the only ones that, everything else is blocked off by wood, but your end boards do have lines in them that kind of just go off the edge of the table. So we did that by just putting a couple layers of really good Gorilla Tape or duct tape or whatever you want to use. And you just dump a big blob of it on the table and you start pushing it down into the cracks. Once you feel you have it really pressed down in there really good, you just take a sponge and you lightly wipe it again and again and again, each time removing all of the concrete from your table surface. This is another reason why I put the clear coat, the polyurethane clear coat on my 2x6s. I wanted to be able to wipe the concrete dust off, where if it was just those stained boards, the concrete and stuff I think would impact that stain, where the clear coat, it wiped right off. When it dries, don't worry about it. It's gonna have a powdery, grayish haze to it that looks horrible. You just wipe that off as good as you can, but when you put your clear coat on it, that haze will disappear. After I put my grout in there and I wipe it off, I leave it for a day. 12 hours at least, maybe 24 would be better. Let it be good and dry. Okay, so this is what it looks like the next day after we've basically built it, glued it all together, and we put the mortar in the cracks. I like how it looks, so we put it in, kind of forced that down into it, and then we wiped it all down with a sponge. It looks like it's all cloudy and stuff, but that'll wipe right off there. That's just dust. And then when you put the clear coat on, it just comes right back to that wet look that we like on it. So from here, all we got to do is wipe this down real good. And then we got to sand and fix all of our edges from these cut boards here. So we'll stain them, and we'll put probably just a coat of polyurethane on them just to shine them up before we dump our epoxy on. So what we have here is we put this tape on here to keep the mortar from coming out of the crack. So this is dry now, so now we have to take it off and kind of hold your breath. Hope you don't rip all your finish off the board, and hope that the concrete stays in the crack. And again, you can also see where you messed up. So this one here is a good example of what we were trying to avoid but didn't do a very good job. So we'll have to fix that. Those cracks are so small, it was really hard to get that mortar down in there. So this is an example of what I'm hoping didn't happen. It's not the end of the world, these here. We can fix this. And I don't know what'll happen in time, but that just barely has any in it. And I worked that edge with them. This one here is better. So we do that to all four sides. You got that opening right there. That should be full. It's not. So we're gonna have to fix that. And then here's an example of what we wanted. You got that mortar in there, and it's in there all the way around there. So we did a really good job of filling that one. We got to sand all these and stain them and then clear coat them. And then we'll put the epoxy on and the tops will be done. Epoxy is scary But at the end of the day, it's this simple. You got two parts to your epoxy. Basically, they're liquid and they're clear. Once you put them together, it's drying. You have a certain amount of time to work with it. So this stuff was clear when I poured it in the container. As I was mixing it, it almost turned to the color of milk. Well, that color of milk is basically millions and millions of tiny little air bubbles. And you're going to be forced to get all those air bubbles out of your epoxy or you're going to have a mess. So what I learned, it's a lot easier to not have to get the bubbles out if you don't put any bubbles in it to begin with. Whatever is recommended, follow that. But just understand that the basics, just the raw basics of mixing epoxy is you want it to be blended well together, but you don't want to cause any bubbles during that process. Turn it slower, mix a little bit longer, rev it up as fast as you think you can, but if you start seeing bubbles forming, back it off a little bit. Watch it. You'll get a feel for it. We did. But I can't stress enough how much that'll improve the quality of your project and how that is definitely the thing I struggled with the most. So your base coat you put on with a brush, and you want to put it on basically as thin as you can. Try to use a good brush. You want a brush that your bristles aren't going to come out in. That's the color you do not want, okay? So you're seeing footage on our first one. If when you put it on there you do see a lot of bubbles, it's like I say, it's got that really white, creamy, milky thing. You basically coat the whole table and then you just take a heat gun, or they say you can use a torch as well. I use the heat gun because I have heat guns. And you just got to get it hot and the heat will force those bubbles to pop. Do your best to not have a ton of bubbles before you pour it on there.
All right, so we've got it all prepped. We've put our base coat on there now, and Cassie's just working those air bubbles out. You see, this is what it looks like with bubbles. This is what it looks like without. Then we've got to let that set for about 4 hours, and then we can come dump our final coat on it, and this one will be finished.
After the base coat is dry, then the next step is pretty much the same as the last one, except this time you don't use a brush. Okay, so now what's happening, we're on our second batch, and you'll see the speed that I'm using here, which creates a whole lot less bubbles. Kind of go somewhere towards the middle of the table and just pour some out, and then watch how it expands. So I would go, and I went and just put a row, say these tables are a little over 2 feet wide, I put like a 10-inch wide path right down the middle of my table and just poured it and just kind of went back and forth with it at about 10 inches wide. And then by the time you get to the end, come back and look at what you had, and it's starting to level out on the table, so it'll start to flow. Then what you do is you just look for the areas that don't have any and you dab a little there. Keep in mind, that's what your edges should look like right there. You should literally see stuff dripping off the edges all the way around that table, and then make sure you don't have any pockets or patches where you don't have any.
For the frame, the way I built it is real simple. I'm going to give you a side view of it. You've pretty much got your top view. That's what it'll look like from the top. On the side, I just basically built 2 squares. All right, and then so this is your end view of the frame, and then this is your side view. Then all I did is I took another frame over here, and then I just put one beam between them, and that's my frame. So in steel, this is real easy. What I would tell you is build everything very square. So when you make these square ends, make sure that you really do a good job of holding all of that square, and you build those as one piece, and you build this one as one piece. Then you basically just lay it down and you just weld it. Or you could use 2-inch square tubing, or you could use 2-inch angle iron. I've done it both ways. And then you'll make, basically, that's your frame, and then this is the top of your frame, and you just set your top right into it. It's that simple. this is one of our table supports. This is going to be on the end. It's a real simple frame, but it's built out of pretty heavy stuff, and that's why we can build it real simple. This is strong, I mean, for what we're doing with it. So all we literally do is I build these on each end, and then I just put a rail between the two, and it makes for a real wide open table underneath. So there's nothing down there, and it's really strong, and it's attractive. So literally this is your table frame for that whole table we're building. This is it. The only thing missing is there's one on each end, and then we want to run rail between them, and we're done. That would be your side. That would be just like that. That's how that goes.
Where's the damn square?
Where's the damn square?
Where?
There's the damn square! This is the finished frame. All we have to do now, we decided to go with the weld look on these, so we're not going to be grinding these welds. Instead, we're just cleaning up around them, and we're going to leave that be there as part of the look. So all she has to do is kind of sand these now to kind of get rid of as much of the rust as we can and clean them up. And then we'll clear coat this, and then this will be ready. We went with angle iron up here this time instead of square tubing, just simply because as you've seen earlier, we ran out of the 2-inch square tubing. So I used 2x3 for this part, and then we just used the angle on this. Still be a very strong table. It'll still have basically the same look. When you start moving to wood or some other sort of frame that you want to set this top on, I can throw you a couple ideas up here as to how I would do that. I'd build it the same way, because again, this is a cool table. This is how I would build it. But to make this square strong enough, I would basically use some glue and some clamps, and I'd put it together, and then and some good screw techniques. And again, you can look all over the internet to find that. I would miter this. Now this is wood now that I'm working on. So I'd miter these corners, and then I would glue it, and I would clamp it really good and straight and get it really good and square, and then I'd fire some pins and some screws in it. So that'll make that good and strong. But you want to don't skimp out on that, because this is wood. The nice thing about this one, this is steel, is that weld makes that all one. So when you build with a heavy enough steel, there's nothing you're going to do that's going to cause that to rack or move. Where with wood, if these joints break, you're losing all of the structure of this type of a build. So I'd build that really good, I'd screw it, I'd glue it, and then you can go to any hardware store and get some L brackets and get good sized ones. So I'd probably use 2x4s instead of 2x2s if I was building wood. It's still a cool look. So you're gonna miter them, put them together, and then just go get some L brackets, and they're gonna go kind of like this. And you could put those, if you wanted to, put them on all four corners, and you can put them on both sides. So that really strengthens those joints up really good. What you can do is you can place it, drill all the way through the 2x4, and then put the same bracket on the other side and clamp them together with those steel brackets, and that's going to make that thing look really, really cool. It adds that rustic cool factor to it, and it's also going to make it an extremely strong square. So I'm basically showing you the same design that I built out of steel, only in wood, which isn't as strong, but this would be very strong. I really don't think you'd ever, if you build it that way and put those corner brackets on there, make sure it's good and square, you're not going to ever have that fail. It'll hold any you could dance on it. All right, now as far as for what you're putting in between there, you may have to change some of the stuff we talked about up here depending on how thick your boards are. Same thing applies. If you want to strengthen it a little bit, you're worried about the length, you can put some supports coming from here up to there on the sides, and that would definitely strengthen it up some. You could put a single post in the middle, just even if it's just a single post dead center in the middle of the table. That's going to take so much stress off of these other two legs here. So if you're worried about it in the way that you're building and your building skills, in other words, if you're not really comfortable building stuff and you don't know how well you're getting it together, you could always throw a leg in there, and that's gonna help take a ton of stress off of these joints right here. All of your stress on this entire build is right here. So again, I'm not really telling you how to build your wood frame. I'm giving you ideas. If you can't build with steel, that will work. I'm happy to answer any questions if you guys want to email us or let us know on the videos. I'll do the best to advise you there as I can.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and please share with us any future projects that you'd like to see more information on.